Can you achieve extraordinary results while making the world a better place? I'm Bruce Temkin, and together we'll explore how. Welcome to Humanity at Scale, Redefining Leadership podcast. Join me as I speak with visionary leaders and top experts to uncover the secrets of humanity-centric leadership. Ready to rethink leadership? Let's dive in. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Humanity at Scale, where we explore how leaders can spark more human-centric change while still navigating all the complexity of business today and into the future. Today's guest is someone who has spent her career helping people imagine and design better futures. Lisa K. Solomon sits at a really unique intersection. She's a designer in resident at Stanford's D.school, where she teaches students how to think long-term and lead with possibility. She's also worked closely with senior leaders in global organizations, helping them build the mindsets and practices needed to lead in times of uncertainty and rapid change. Lisa believes that imagination isn't just for artists or inventors. It's a critical leadership muscle. And in a world that's moving faster than ever, she's on a mission to make sure more leaders learn how to flex it. In our conversation, we'll dig into why imagination is often overlooked in business, how to design for what's possible, not just what's probable, and what it takes to embed humanity and ethics into systems, especially as we navigate technologies like AI. Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Bruce, I am so thrilled to be with you, and I loved that intro. I think you can give a masterclass on how to welcome guests with authenticity and care. I loved it.
Well, all I have to do is have wonderful guests who have the background that you have, and it makes my job easy. And talking about that background, it's you don't have the type of career where you can tell your parents I was an accountant or your friends that you're an engineer. So if someone was to ask you what you do, how would you describe it in simple terms?
Well, now I'm going to tell them to listen to your intro because my family's been asking me that for a long time. But it is true. I feel like I get up every day to help more people feel like they can imagine better possibilities and then bring the skills forward to bring those possibilities to life. So we're a little unfamiliar when we think about futures thinking as a skill set that can be learned or strategic foresight. And that's mostly because we just haven't been exposed to it, not because we're not capable of learning it. Look, our current day is filled with things that people in the past imagined that should come to life. Why can't we all build those skills of looking at what's around us and using our incredible human capacity to imagine, right? That's one of the things that continues to make us different than AI, to think about what's the kind of future I want to be a part of, and now how do I use critical thinking skills and system skills like the ones you talk about to bring those futures to life. So I teach classes at Stanford like Inventing the Future. Currently, I'm teaching a class called View from the Future, and it's really about helping the leaders and learners of our next generation understand that there's a much wider swath from which they can build from, imagine from, that they're capable of if they practice it and put it to work, and that the future doesn't have to be outsourced to just a few.
I love that, and we're going to get into that. We're going to get into all the future thinking, but before we do, I want a little bit more of you before we get there, because I think our listeners are wondering, boy, that sounds really cool. How do you get there? So you live in the sort of this intersection of design and futurism. Give us a little bit of the journey that ended up with you here.
I love that, Bruce. Honestly, it's a journey that is filled with insatiable curiosity and a desire to learn from people doing cool things. And I want to talk to you about, one thing that we just talked about in our last class of our kickoff class to View to the Future, where we had a guest that talked about the power of savoring surprises. Like, how do we get into surprises? But to get back to your question, I was the child of a chief learning officer, which I think you will appreciate, Bruce. In the early 90s, nobody really knew what that was. And it was my mother who just really was a lifelong learner and saw herself as a partner to leaders in organizations to help them learn and to help them think at the systems level. At the time, total quality management was the big buzzword about what we can learn from reducing variance. And what she very much realized early on and passed on to me is that the quality of the relationships will determine how we think about the choices that we make and who those choices impact. And she was always giving me a lot of different articles and books to read, even in my high school years when I was like, Mom, I just want to read about, I don't know, some werewolf romance novel for teenagers. And she was like, let's talk about Margaret Wheatley and systems thinking. But it really gave me this perspective that learning as a currency was critical. And I'll say I'll couple that with a childhood passion of mine from my earliest days about understanding what made certain experiences magical. So, and I could start with one of our favorite, Walt Disney World, right? Like, who does not love to go to Walt Disney World? And I was not one of those kids that said, hey, I want to be a princess or I want to be this. I was like, I want to be president of Walt Disney World because I want to understand every single choice that someone makes to create magic for somebody else. And then as I grew up, my grandfather was actually in the restaurant business. I understood that there was a connection there, that when you go and you have a phenomenal experience in a restaurant, like what has happened that all of those pieces come together? At the time, we didn't have language that some great designers have given us around like that's called service design, that's called experience design. So just from a very early age, I'll connect those dots. I was passionate about experiences that led to meaningful moments that lasted with you, and the discipline of learning about what systems were behind them to make them come true. And that was really a self-directed career that's now spanned many decades of thinking about design across different mediums. So first design in a retail, which is where I spent probably the first 5 or 6 years, like, and we can all understand, for example, one of my first projects was with Dunkin' Donuts, like early in the 90s, they were worried that all of America was going to be on a diet because that's what the market research told us. And they were considering making a low-fat donut, but at the same time,
Oh,
Krispy Kreme. Yeah,
that,
exactly,
oh,
exactly. And at the same time, Krispy Kreme had just opened up in southern part of the US with lines out the door starting at 5 a.m. So a great indicator that market research is not necessarily those statistically significant surveys where value gets created, right? That there are other ways of taking in qualitative, we would call that design research to understand what people want and need without them even telling us what they want and need. So my first big chunk of my career was really about kind of consumer design and retail design. Then I moved out to Silicon Valley in the late 90s and Internet 1.0 to try to then move that set of discipline to an online experience. Same thing, like what choices could someone make to create a great online experience? And in the last 20 years, I've really moved that to be organizational design and leadership design, right? How do decision makers create choices that impact others to help them do their best work and create value for their customers?
so it's interesting. Your work on getting. Let's talk about leaders, and we'll go to your class in a second. Which is, you live in a world where leaders probably you focus on are really pushed for short termism, right? They look at near term things. Yet you work on like 50-year horizons sometimes, right? What does it feel like to hold that type of a long term vision with people around you who are pushing you for more near term discussions?
Oh, it's a great question, Bruce. And listen, it's highly uncomfortable. Let's go back to basics. As human beings, we like to know that we're going to be around tomorrow, right? Our ancient ancestors, right? Some of the earliest forms of communication were those cave drawings that were basically like predator out there, don't go. That survival instinct. We don't like uncertainty, and one way of dealing with uncertainty is shortening the horizon of where we can deliver. And then we'll sort of take a step back and say, well, most of our systems and organizations are also designed that way. We think about, well, what's our quarterly plan? What's our 3 to 5 year plan, which feels like the longest stretch? So we learn to operate even as young children, right? This school year, this academic calendar, the word of the week, right? To orient towards delivering, right? And of course, when we deliver in those short terms, we get a hit of dopamine and we feel very proud and triumphant. We don't really have great mechanisms to say, well, what does it mean to actually live like a good ancestor, making choices over the long term, planting seeds? That's a much different set of incentives to get us comfortable with that, and we're not practiced at it. So, part of my job is to, first of all, remind our students and our leaders that we can do that and that others have done that in the past. And just because our systems around us don't reward that doesn't mean that they're not capable of it. And I'll definitely point your listeners to Roman Krznarik's wonderful work called The Good Ancestor, which really tries to highlight what does it mean to have legacy thinking and legacy mindsets versus these short-term efforts towards performance and delivery. And it's a much more liberating stance because in many ways it allows us to take the pressure off of being right in the short term, off of having to deliver, off of that pressure to perform, and can get us into that more imaginary space if the conditions are created to allow us to do it, which is a big if.
So let's talk about being a good ancestor, because I love that term. I kind of feel like the society we're in is making that harder. And what's your sense of whether it's easier or harder? It hasn't changed in terms of having that type of long-term thinking.
Yeah, no, I do think it's much harder, Bruce. And, we can point to various pieces of research and evidence that suggest that, whether just talking to people, having a conversation where they say, hey, you're feeling like there's a lot of luxurious time to think about the long-term future in this moment. No, it feels like the future is coming at us faster and faster. Why is that, right? Well, of course, technology is speeding up. We've got more things driving for our attention. There's a lot of great work now really coining the language around the attention economy, which is really where we are right now, where you have, huge corporations that have many tens of thousands of PhDs and algorithms and AI that are getting rewarded for taking your attention away from long-term thinking and into the short attention span. And of course, you can look at what's happening to our younger generation that's growing up in this environment where all they know is this short-term attention span. And it used to be that a TED Talk, if you remember, was like, "Ooh, only 18 minutes? How are they going to get everything in 18 minutes?" And now it's like 18 seconds? Gosh, can't you get it shorter? TikTok really rewards 10. So I do think, we have kind of like just sort of gotten into this sort of tizzy of quick response, but it's not good for our nervous system, Bruce. I mean, I just think it's one of the things we're all walking around with is this sense of like, how do we calm down? And then we have this sort of like all these messages of like, well, if you just slow down, and as if it's an individual thing that you are responsible versus a systemic thing that's actually kind of organized to take your attention away from the longer term. I'll say my dear colleague Scott Dorley, who's the creative director of the D.school, he has this great expression where he says, we're trying to make decisions when we never feel up to speed, right? We're never up to speed. And he said, if we think about what that acronym, it's nuts, right? It is literally nuts. We are never up to speed. And again, that's not the way our natural wiring system likes to be. And so we're always in this state of kind of heightened adrenaline, which I just don't think is healthy. It's not healthy for our organizations. It's not healthy for our families. It's not healthy for our communities. And yet it's kind of hard to unpack, given all the pressures that's facing. I'll say one more thing, Bruce, about this, because I know it can be hard to visualize some of these concepts. In 2016, Thomas Friedman, great New York Times bestselling author, wrote a book called Thank You for Being Late. And in the opening chapter, he had a wonderful conversation with Astro Teller, who is the head of Google Moonshots. And in it, Astro Teller created this chart. And he mapped the exponential pace of technologies as an exponential curve going up and to the right. He said, that is what's happening on technology. He said, human adaptability is much more linear. And so there's this place where they cross over where at the time, Astro Teller said, this is where we are. And it was on the steeper part of the curve past where the human adaptability is. Now, I would argue that was 9 years ago, right? Where are we today? I think that through Gen AI and how the data sets are only making the technology stronger and more accessible and cheaper, we're on a steeper exponential curve, right? Technology's everywhere. And some of our systems around polarization, around, some of the choices around censorship, around the siphoning off of our attention, I might argue that human adaptability is going down a bit, right? So we're actually making that gap wider, and I think that's the leadership challenge of the moment.
Cool. So for our listeners, they might be going, "Oh my God, the world's taking over. We can't keep up." But I want to get to sort of your view on how we control things. 'Cause I love your site. Your site starts with a bold statement: the future doesn't have to be something that happens to us, right? Because all this discussion sounds like it's coming at us and we have no control. But what you're trying to teach leaders is you don't need to be a passenger. You can be a driver on the futures. Talk to us a little bit about how do you actually make the future happen? What's your advice in teaching to leaders?
Oh, Bruce, I'm so glad you asked that. Yes, fundamentally, all of my work is about creating postures of hope and practices of resilience, right? Like, how do we help more people feel agenic, even amid all these conditions that we're talking about, to be more successful in bringing about the kind of change and the kind of futures that they want to see come to life? And the first thing I would say is to help our students and all of our leaders recognize that where we are today, as I said earlier, was a response to somebody else's imagination. And this idea that we can, first of all, take a wider stock of what's happening and make the distinguish it between the a wider range of possible futures of where we want to go versus the probable future of the future that we think is happening to us. And to systemically break down and say, wow, what would have to be true for this new future to come to life? What would we be able to do? And I do that in very practical ways by, first of all, pointing out more people that have done that than we necessarily, put in our worldview. When I say, hey, who shapes our future? And I hear, as you might expect, well, Jeff Bezos or Musk or others. And I say, yeah, what about Dolly Parton? Dolly Parton shapes our future. Do you know how? She invested in the vaccine. She used her brand to, get on and sort of demystify and lower the threshold in order to bring about her preferred future, which was more people being inoculated from COVID at the time. Just an example. I've written about Taylor Swift as a futurist. Why? Right? We tend to talk about, oh, what a great entertainer. No. When she went on her Eras tour, she intentionally would partner with local food banks and community support systems in order to elevate what they were doing and help more people realize what was happening in their own cities to be able to make a difference. Not to mention the economic boom that she created when she visited a city. Not to mention modeling, if you remember at the time, these DIY bracelets that people would exchange. All of a sudden, you have a 14-year-old that has felt totally isolated, lonely, having the experience of taking something that they created, giving it to a stranger, and getting something back. That little exchange of micro moments that says, I'm not alone, I'm around community, all of those, I would say, are futurist moves, right? The ability to have bold imagination about something that doesn't exist, that can exist, the willingness to try something to bring it to life, to learn along the way, and to then talk about getting others excited with you to make sure that you talk about it's not a small venture, that we can actually scale it. And so I'm really about helping more leaders see that there's a wider range of possibilities, that their decisions in order to bring those futures to life is a way of shaping those futures. And then by talking about it in ways that lift all boats is a way of sharing those futures that we want to be a part of.
So that's great. It sounds like that's sort of like a playbook of those three things, right? But leaders have other stuff they're trying to do to get done, right? So what are the practical ways that you suggest that a leader can actually embrace a posture of hope and the world of possibility?
Yep. Great question. Well, one of the things I'd say is even though it feels like we're playing whack-a-mole with all the things that we're attending to, I think the first thing is to carve out some time to bring in other perspectives and or to read things that are not directly in your world right now. I think leaders sometimes get in that tunnel vision and they feel like their responsibility is to know everything and be on top of everything within their sphere. So one of the core things that futures thinkers do is that they move beyond an inside out orientation. And one of the best ways to talk about that, I've yet to meet a leader that doesn't know the term SWOT, right? For how to think about their organizations in terms of strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. Super important. It's just also super insular, right? Futurists take an outside in perspective, looking at what changes are happening in the macro world. What's happening, they call it STEEP is one acronym. What's happening on the social side, like what's happening with changes of demographics. Are people moving to cities or rural areas? What's going on with their buying patterns? What's happening on the technology front, which is certainly taking up a lot of space right now, and how we think about change and what's facilitating the rapid pace of it. How to think about economic signals, how to think about environmental signals, and how to think about political signals. So that's a lot still for a leader to take in at one time, but they can make choices that, first of all, allocates time in their weekly schedule to learn from it, make it social, right? Like, so you can imagine that, let's say a leader has a standing meeting with their executive team, and they're going to take the first 15 minutes or 10 minutes of every meeting to say, hey, what's an interesting article that you saw today or this week that caught your attention? Something that we should be paying attention to more closely. Someone we should bring in and learn from. Somewhere we should go. I often say one of the favorite quotes that futurists sometimes talk about comes from William Gibson, the great science fiction writer. And he says, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So the question is, okay, yeah, how do you go visit the future? The class I'm teaching now, for example, is something that all leaders can do. It's called View from the Future, where we bring in someone every week who is pioneering the edges of an industry. And the idea is certainly not to help our students memorize anything or have answers, but it's actually to foster new questions. Like, wow, I didn't know that that was happening. So, for example, last year we had Philip Ross talk about the future of living systems, about how sometime in the future, we're all going to be walking around with jackets made of algae that's going to capture carbon from the atmosphere, and we're all going to participate in creating more sustainable futures. Or the fact that buildings are going to be made out of living material that is going to be able to help again, improve the air quality just by the very manufacturing. Now, we're not there now, right? But it takes a little bit of imagination and a little bit of knowledge on the edge to be like, that material is going to get better. It's going to get cheaper. How might that redesign how we think about the kind of dwellings that we have that are both climate resistant and regenerative towards our future?
So it's interesting. There's a way of trying to identify where the future is heading and then mapping what you want to achieve in a way that aligns with that future is heading. Now, you talk about being a good ancestor. This is humanity at scale, right? Where we talk about how do you get leaders to think about that learning and taking advantage of a way that's good for humanity and good for people, because they could also look at that and say there's a way to be devious with that learning and understanding and take it in a different direction.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to say out loud, imagination is not necessarily positive, right? It is neutral. It can be used for good possibilities like humanity at scale. And even saying those words, I imagine, conjures up lots of different things for lots of different people. And it can be used for ill. So I don't think we should fall into an assumption that just by saying this word imagination, that it's necessarily a good thing, right? It's the stewardship. And one of the things that I think is so critical for all leaders to do, particularly in this time where we are facing novel challenges that don't have precedent, right? We can't go back to the best practices or the blueprints, is to get clear about their values. And in a book that I co-authored called Design a Better Business, there is one of my favorite templates. It's called the design criteria. And the design criteria basically says, before you build anything new, really articulate what matters to you in building it. So 4 categories: what must it have, what should it have, what could it have, and what it won't have. And when you do that kind of baseline mapping of your values, first of all, it streamlines the process of creating something, because if there's something that someone comes up with, but it's in the won't category, well, just don't even spend any energy on it. But it really helps you get clear about the choices that you and your team is going to make in order to advance something forward. And I want to say another really important part on this, and this comes from another favorite quote of mine from Bob Johansen, who used to run the Institute for the Future. And he says, the future will reward clarity, but will punish certainty. And an exercise like the design criteria, must, should, could, won't, really helps you get clear about your values. Not necessarily what quarter are we going to hit, what revenue, in what way, because we don't know. We don't know. But we can have total clarity about the kinds of decisions that we're going to make, even with incomplete information. And we see leaders struggling with that. I'm not saying that this is easy, Bruce. I mean, we can look at any number of challenges that high profile leaders are facing right now, whether it's leaders within large organizations that are trying to navigate some of the new changes coming out of the new administration, higher ed leaders that are trying to figure out, right, how do they communicate clearly the values of their university, all the while, again, different pressures are being faced at them. So I think it really is a time for leaders to, first of all, go internally to say, wait a minute, what are we going to stand for? What are our values? How do we ensure that regardless of the information coming in, we are being consistent and congruent according to those values? Even when some of those are, I'm not exactly sure, but here's what we know we won't do, right? So again, you're providing some sense of safety, of continuity in the choices that you make and how you respond.
If you're enjoying this episode, make sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss a conversation. We've got plenty more great stories coming your way. So I love that. So even in a world of possibilities, it feels like it's open and free of any type of rigor. You're saying, let's go into that with a better understanding of our values. Let's put rigor around our values, but not necessarily around controlling where our thinking might go.
Absolutely. And Bruce, I'll say, like, connecting to something we just said earlier, I think it's beneficial for leaders to rehearse the future rather than to be blindsided by the present, right? So if we marry some of those practices, the anticipation practices of taking what's in plain sight and saying, how might this go across a number of different directions? That's available for us to do. There's a number of different strategies we can do that. And we can say, if it goes in this direction, how prepared are we? If it goes in this direction, how prepared are we? What choice would we make? And to do that in a simulation ahead of time, rather than when it's like, hey, you need to make a statement, in 6 hours. That's usually not when we do our best work. And I think one of the things that the pandemic really exposed to us now 5 years ago, it's hard to believe, is that we don't want to be caught flat-footed when possible. I mean, that was, a crunch for leaders at every single level of having to make decisions amid totally new, novel, disruptive conditions. And I think the leaders that did better had that reservoir of values that they could pull from in order to bring new ideas to life. And that this moment, which is still quite in flux, we have an opportunity to help leaders practice these skills so they can get better at it and not expect them to be masters in the moment a crisis hits. That's just unreasonable.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've my advice to organizations during times of change is around scenario planning, like you talked about. Let's think about 3 different directions the world might go. Let's think about how prepared we are or ill prepared we are, and understand that. That feels closer to strategic planning than some of the futuring that you talk about, right? Is there like a near-term futuring and a long-term futuring, right? How do you distinguish all of this from normal strategic planning cycles?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that is the background that I started to do over 20 years ago when I shifted to organizational design and futures was scenario planning practice with an incredible group called Global Business Network that was started by Peter Schwartz, who did his scenario planning work at Shell, Stuart Brand, the creator of the Whole Earth Catalog, now still very involved with the Long Now Foundation, which is really Stuart's work of taking that long-term thinking. And again, I think it's similar to themes that we talked about earlier. If you think about strategic planning is usually let's create a 3 to 5 year plan based on how the company has done and where we want it to go. So we'll start with where we were. We'll look at historic trends. We'll put in a sensitivity analysis. We'll do a competitive landscape. We'll predict the future in some degree with some variance in a discounted cash flow, with P&Ls in the future, and we're literally discounting the future with the discounted cash flow. Important piece of work, just incomplete in a world filled with speed and surprise. That's where the scenario planning, that outside in, can be really helpful. So you can take that strategic plan and say, listen, if the world moves this way, where are opportunities? Where are we exposed? If the world moves this way, same kinds of questions. So scenario planning is a way to go and visit the future, to check your assumptions in the present, to see how exposed are you in them, what would have to go right. And when done well, you can look at a number of different scenarios, as you talked about, and say, well, what's robust among all of them? What's a smart move we can make? And I will tell you, shortly after the pandemic hit, I ran an internal scenario planning exercise with my colleagues at Stanford within our D.school, again, very, very early on. And it allowed us to identify the things we were going to track more closely to try to get a better understanding of the intensity and the duration, as everyone was, but against different ways of understanding how conditions might unfold for us and our students. And certainly one of the robust things that came out of that was the fact that all of our students were probably very destabilized and could have used some support. So we initiated a plan where we reached out personally to every single student that we were in the process of working with that got abruptly dismissed from campus, to just reach out. And just that tiny signal, that tiny choice of saying, hey, we are here for you. We care about you. Are you okay? That's the kind of stuff that is much more aligned with the being the good ancestor, even though you think it may be discounted, than we might realize. And by the way, that's also a practice of agency, of being able to say, look, I can't control this, but here's what I can control. So really giving them tools to distinguish between those two. So if nothing else, we don't feel helpless in this moment.
So it's interesting. I love the idea of agency, right? Because it simplifies the world in front of us, right? There's a world out there we can't control, but let's take care of what we can. But at the same time, you're also talking about possibilities that could be overwhelming to a leader. And especially as we talk about the possibilities of like AI, new technology, new possibilities. How do you help a leader reconcile the broad set of possibilities that are growing and AI is accelerating, while keeping the notion of being a good ancestor front and center?
Yeah. Again, another great question. And this is, I think, the other layer between the strategic planning and scenario planning, which is the toggling between the two, is to say, okay, we could stretch really far. What would that mean if we did that? Where are we today? There's a practice that futurists do called backcasting, where we put out a possible future and then we work backwards to say, okay, let's say we're working towards a future in 2035, not that far away, really, 10 years. Then we would say, okay, if this is it, and by the way, important to articulate that future in as much vivid detail as possible in order to make it feel vibrant, right? In order to give it texture, not just a spreadsheet. I would say, if the future is embedded in a number in your spreadsheet, like, there's probably not a lot of empathy in that. So to try to give it some real weight to it, to try to understand it in more narrative form, more texture form, and then to say, okay, if that's 2035, what would have to be true in 2033? What would have to be true in 2030? What would have to be true 2020? Oh, well, that's only 3 years from now. So we can start to do a little bit of that plausibility test, not to limit where we want to go, but just to ensure that we're being very thoughtful about it from both lenses. I think it is also important, though, when we think about the toggling between here and where we want to get to and where we want to get to back, that again, we open ourselves up to imaginative ways that might actually not work in a linear path, right? But helps us articulate some important milestones that would signal that far out future is something that we want. And again, I think it requires an aperture towards learning, towards really trying to understand and say, where is the future happening in different places? Look, Bruce, there was a time where Silicon Valley was the place where leaders from around the world would come to try to understand what was going on here. Right? And they would almost go and visit the HP garage, as if like going to visit the garage would give them, the window into innovation and growth. And so, I think that's a version of like, let me go visit the future see what's happening, but they can't take what happens here back there, right? That a leader now has to figure out, well, what are the practices that might work within our culture, might work within our current operating system, might help us stretch but not break where we are in order to move towards a different future. And I think, building on the conversations that you're having here, that's very much a practice of humanity at scale. When I would host leaders here, trying to understand the edges of technology of where we were going, I would have to remind them, look, everyone back home in your organization probably thinks they're getting fired in some way, or their antenna is up. Your job is to come back and not just talk about what you learned, but help make connections about where they are to help bring them into the journey of where you want to go. And so that's a really critical part of this futures work that I often don't think gets enough attention.
Well, it's interesting. So I wonder if you were to like bring together every teacher you've taught to one place and build one future together, what would you hope that that future would look like?
Oh my God, that's a big question. Well, the one thing that we do start off usually emphasizing is that the future is not one thing, it's many things just inherently, right? So maybe the first thing I would say is to think in multiplicities of possibility. But I think the most important thing is about cultivating their sense of agency, whoever they are, that the choices that they can make a difference. And Bruce, one of the things when we close out our classes that I always find so rewarding is when we ask our students, okay, after spending time, whether it's inventing the future, view from the future, a big program I ran last year called The Future's Happening, we say, reflect for a minute. I used to think dot, 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 and now I think dot, dot, dot. And to me, that's the ultimate lever of change. And so when I see students say, I used to think that the future was only for others and not for me, and now I know there's a number of practices and disciplines that I can use to help shape the future I want to be a part of, I think more people like that. That's what I want. Or I used to think that imagination or thinking about the future was a gene intrinsic to some, and I didn't have any. And now I believe that it's something I can grow and intentionally develop. That's a growth mindset applied towards individual talent that I think is what we need to unleash. So at every step, whether I'm working at the executive level or sometimes I go into K-12 classrooms, I feel like my job is to create conditions for people to feel like they can anticipate, imagine, and design better futures, right? That's where it is, starting wherever they are, and to give them practice in feeling that and flexing that so they feel like, oh, I have more agency than I think.
It's interesting. I remember I was at a conference where this artist asked the people in the room, "How many of you are can draw a face?" And a couple people raised their hand. And then he asked a really compelling question, which is, "Why, if I asked a bunch of fourth graders who could do that, everyone would raise their hand?" Yet somehow we've all lost this sort of feeling of possibility, right? That we've limited ourselves, and I feel like there's a little bit of that in there too, right? We're closing down what we think we can do.
Yes, yes, and it's even worse than that, right? Where we have formal education, which at least here in North America, has really been one that in many ways rewards narrow thinking and right answers. I don't have the study for imagination, but my closest proxy is Warren Berger, who wrote a book called A More Beautiful Question, someone that you might want to think about talking to in the future. See that, Bruce? Always thinking about the future. He talks about, really the power of questioning to change the world and to ignite innovation, that most great innovation started with a question of some kind. And he has this chart early in his book where he talks about that when children go to formal education, right, reading goes up, writing goes up, but questioning takes a nosedive. Why? Why is that? Well, you can just pause and think about, what does a typical classroom look like? Does it reward the kid asking a divergent question about something that takes the teacher off track, not according to the lesson plan? No. So soon you learn as early as even 5 or 6 years old that kind of wandering, that kind of possibility thinking, that kind of questioning is not rewarded. And it only gets worse, right? Because we are geared towards, well, you got to do well to get into these schools, to get into this. So there's a lot of work to do there, but just noticing that our systems are not rewarding this possibility thinking is one important part. And then the second part is realizing that now technology and social media, going back to the attention economy and how people are fighting for seconds of our time, it's literally polluting our own imagination, right? We are not giving ourselves time to digest, to think for ourselves. So we have multiple societal systems that are narrowing our ability to be a possibility thinker, to be an imaginative thinker. And I think the work that you're doing, talking to folks that are trying to take us out of that worldview and remind, no, 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 we are capable. Look at all these things we're capable of. That's a big part of it because, as I said, if we can't imagine it, then we can't build it. And so we just have to continue to remind each other of the wider examples of imagination in action and to find more connection points to invite others to do the same.
Awesome. Now I'd like to end up with a few questions that like to ask all of our guests. The first one is, if you could pick one leadership skill that will be even more important in the future, what would it be?
Imagination.
Why am I not surprised?
It's imagination. Imagination, right. You're right. The willingness to wonder, right? To question status quo, to say, does it have to be this way?
All right. The second one is, if you could wave a magic wand, I like to hand out this power for a little bit of time. I trust you with it. And you change one thing that would make organizations more human-centric, what would it be?
I think it's empathy, really, Bruce. I mean, the ability to make connections that these big ideas that we have will require humans to help bring it to life. And in order to help those humans bring it to life, how do I understand what they need to hear and what they need to feel, how they need to be supported in order to do that? When we unleash human potential, I think the opportunity to imagine, design better futures is limitless. But it takes that pause to say, what are the impacts? How do I help get more people excited about this? I'm a huge believer in the power of an abundance mindset, right? That we are capable, right? That we are capable of learning, we are capable of growing, we are capable of doing if given the chance. But we can't take for granted that people are in a position in order to immediately get what's being asked of us and to do. So I think empathy is foundational to that.
Great. For leaders inspired by your work, what's one final piece of advice you'd like to leave with them?
I think that they, regardless of how senior they are, that they are capable of learning and that modeling that learning is critical for everybody else watching them, right? That this ability to say, I'm going to turn towards the future with an open mindset, not to ignore all the things that we need to be doing in order to keep our organization afloat, in order to help ensure that our people feel safe and protected, that we are putting our best foot forward to create value for others. And I'm going to model that as a leader, I'm still questioning. I'm still bringing in outside perspectives. I'm still pushing myself to think beyond and to articulate wonderments beyond, what feels comfortable. And I'm going to do that in a generative and generous way, because that's the way that we're going to thrive in the future.
Love that. Humanity at scale and action. For our listeners, and I think many of them will want to follow you, for those that want to follow you, what's the best way to do it? Where should they go? Where should they follow your work?
Thank you, Bruce. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so encourage people to look me up on LinkedIn, Lisa K. Solomon. Every week, for example, I post a summary of what's happening in our View from the Future class. Last week, we kicked it off with legendary investor Mike Maples Jr. talking about pattern breakers and already posted that. We're going to be having upcoming sessions with people on the edges of food and fashion and media. So really encourage people. And I'm always trying to model what I ask of others, which is to be generous and generative. So I'm always posting things that I think will help widen people's worldview of what's possible.
Great. And I'll post the links to that in my show notes and all of that. So super. Thank you, Lisa. This is great. I appreciate having you.
Bruce, thank you so much. And thank you for everything that you're doing on behalf of humans everywhere.
Thanks. Well, I hope you found my conversation with Lisa K. Solomon as energizing and as expansive as I did. If you enjoyed this discussion, Please share it with your colleagues and friends who are thinking about customer experience, employee experience, or purpose-driven leadership of any type. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring conversations on what it truly means to lead with impact and purpose. Now let's dive into the after show, a segment where I'll reflect on the key takeaways from my conversation with Lisa and share some additional thoughts on how leaders can bring these ideas to life in their own organizations. Thanks again for tuning in. That conversation with Lisa K. Solomon really lit me up. She's got this unique ability to challenge the way we think about leading into the future without leaving us feeling overwhelmed or helpless. Here are 5 takeaways that have been echoing in my head since we talked. First, imagination is learnable. Lisa said we're unfamiliar with futures thinking not because we're incapable, but because we've never been exposed to it. That's huge. Most leaders weren't trained to imagine beyond the next quarter, but imagination isn't a rare talent. It's a muscle we can build. And in a world filled with complexity, that muscle might just be a leader's most important asset. Second, we're living inside systems designed for short-term thinking. Lisa joked that we're all stuck in this school year, the academic calendar, the word of the week. And she's not wrong. Even our nervous systems are wired to crave near-term wins. She quoted her colleague who said, "We're trying to make decisions when we never feel up to speed." And that's nuts. Literally nuts. Never up to speed. That sense of constant rush is the enemy of the thoughtful leadership. Third, clarity beats certainty. One of my favorite quotes from Lisa was, "The future will reward clarity, but punish certainty." We can't predict the future, but we can be clear about what we value. Her design criteria framework, what must be true, should be true, could be true, and won't be true, is a practical tool for staying anchored in your values while navigating ambiguity. The fourth idea is that the future is shaped by more people than we realize. Lisa brought up Dolly Parton and Taylor Swift, not your typical futurists, right? But their actions changed lives, influenced systems, and shifted narratives. That's the kind of cultural influence leaders can learn from. And Lisa said, shaping the future doesn't require a tech lab. It requires bold imagination and meaningful action. And finally, maybe the most profound idea, be a good ancestor. Lisa posed the question, are we planting seeds that will benefit people we'll never meet? That's not a soft idea. It's a powerful leadership posture. She said, we don't have great mechanisms to say, what does it mean to live like a good ancestor? But that's the challenge, to slow down, to imagine long-term impact, and to lead in a way that future generations will be proud of. That idea of being a good ancestor is right at the heart of Humanity at Scale, because this movement isn't just about making business more human today, it's about making humanity more sustainable tomorrow. The future isn't just a destination, it's a responsibility. So here's the big question Lisa leaves us with. What kind of future are you helping to design? And how do your everyday choices reflect the kind of ancestor you want to be? That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it has sparked new thinking. Thanks for tuning in to Humanity at Scale, Redefining Leadership podcast. Remember, true leadership isn't only about achieving short-term results. It's about creating a lasting positive impact on all of the people you touch. Join me next time as we uncover more insights and strategies for humanity-centric leadership. Until then, I'm Bruce Temkin, encouraging you to lead with purpose and empathy and to be the spark that elevates humanity at scale.